So we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our first speaker today, Zoe Tressel. Zoe serves as research and data consultant for St. John's Riverkeeper's advocacy team. She originally joined the team as an intern in 2023 and received dual master's degrees in marine science and public policy at Jacksonville University in April of 2024. And she also spent time working as a biological scientist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Zoe is passionate about creating informed, science-driven policy that will ultimately serve to provide safer, cleaner, and more accessible environmental systems throughout important watersheds like the St. Johns River. Thanks so much for being here, Zoe. And if you could kick us off, tell us a little bit about data centers. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Like Dryden said, my name is Zoe Tressel, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. So, if you are not familiar with our organization, St. John's Riverkeeper is a local environmental nonprofit, and we serve as the voice of the river. We look at ourselves like a watchdog. Our mission is to protect and defend the St. John's River and advocate for its protection. So, we do that by educating and empowering citizens like you to protect our river. So, again, thank you for being here, and we will go ahead and get started. So, we're just going to do a brief overview of what data centers are. I know that not everybody knows about them, or you may have some misconceptions. So, data centers are a facility that just primarily contains electronic equipment. And so that's used to process, store, and transmit digital information. It could be used for cloud storage. It could be used for artificial intelligence, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of data centers. It can be used in cryptocurrency mining, weather modeling, genome sequencing, and many, many, many other uses. But they range in size and basically from small to hyperscale. And they differ in their consumption of water and energy, depending on their primary use. So when you think of an AI data center, you're probably thinking of a hyperscale data center. And so those have drawn particular attention in our climate today due to their size and rapid growth and substantial impacts on local communities. So where does Florida currently stand? We are not the worst of the worst, but we are in the top 10 as far as states that are growing in data center permitting and construction. So two-thirds of all data centers that have been built or are in development since 2022 are located in water-stressed areas. So in states like Florida, cooling demand becomes an even greater concern because the outside air contributes to machine heat. And with recent record lows in rainfall and extreme drought in many parts of Florida, water usage is becoming an even greater concern. So as you can see, there's already over 100 data centers in Florida, and substantial investment in data centers is likely as we look to the future. So this is a very prevalent and urgent issue. And so obviously you guys all care about this too, so we really appreciate you coming and learning about it. So this map that you're looking at here is from floridadatacenters.org. I wanted to preface this with a couple caveats first. This goes into kind of the risk associated with each county as Florida Data Centers does their methodology basically. So the gray counties are considered low risk, the green are moderate, yellow are high, and red are very high. So any county that you see that's red is a county that already has large data center infrastructure planned or ongoing. However, there is a caveat to this. This map specifically shows hyperscale data centers, and so there are already plenty of small and medium data centers that are already in existence or are being planned that this map does not necessarily depict. And so the risk, quote unquote, can be looked at as slightly higher than what this map actually shows. So Florida data centers, when they do their risk assessment for counties, they look at four primary factors. The first being power availability. So hyperscale data centers, again, 50 megawatts or above, um, require continuous power, and it can range from 50 to 1200 megawatts of power. So every siting study that you look at is going to put power availability as the single largest factor when they consider where they want to build out. Water capacity is the second factor that we look at. And Florida's 5 water management districts have very different capacity conditions. South Florida district is under significant Everglades restoration and water supply pressure. The St. Johns River Water Management District, in particular, covers 23% of Florida's land area, and it serves roughly 4.7 million residents across Northeast and East Central Florida. So average daily water use hit 1.5 billion gallons in 2023. And in May, the St. Johns River Water Management District declared a phase 3 water shortage declaration for Northeast and Central Florida. And so that just gives you an idea of the current climate that we're in, how big a deal that water capacity is, and why we need to pay attention to it. The third factor is land availability. So hyperscale campuses in particular need 200 to 1,500 acres in a single contiguous parcel. So those parcels are most available in rural counties. Um, but of course, rural counties don't necessarily um, you know, have the power availability that's sought by large data centers. And so it's a give and take. And then the fourth risk factor that Florida Data Centers looks at is current exposure. And so counties with known data center projects and counties adjacent to them are at a higher risk just because once data centers build out their infrastructure, developers tend to cluster near those same sites to share power and fiber. All right, so now we're going to go into the emerging environmental threats. First and foremost, like I discussed, water shortages, drought, our aquifer are all huge concerns for us Floridians, and data centers are well known to be huge consumers of water. So mid-sized facilities can consume an average of 300,000 gallons per day. Large facilities can consume up to 5 million gallons per day, which is equivalent to about 15,000 households. And basically, because data centers have to operate continually, they produce extreme amounts of heat. They require vast amounts of cooling in Florida's climate. That makes it extremely difficult. And so the graphic that you're seeing on the right of your screen is an indirect water usage compared to direct water usage in the US. This is taken directly from the International Energy Agency. And while you might not think it, direct water usage for cooling is actually only 20% of the water used for data centers. 80% is actually used in electricity generation. So I know that I had that misconception when I first started looking into data centers. So it is interesting to see that direct water usage for cooling may not be as large a percent, but it's still a huge concern. And there are open and closed loop cooling systems. And so when you have a closed loop system, you may be saving more direct water usage because you're not immediately evaporating it to the air, but you are using more electrical generation. And so you're indirectly using a lot more water. So direct water usage and indirect water usage obviously has huge implications for our springs, our aquifer, and our river. Um, Basically, it's a it's a chain, right? Like when you're doing open loop systems and it's constantly evaporating back into the air, that water is not going back into our aquifer. It's not going back into our surface water, feeding feeding our freshwater systems, feeding our estuaries, and that has a huge implication for our underwater vegetation and underwater aquatic species. All right, our next one is going to be energy consumption. So, like I said, data centers vary in size and scale, but a typical AI-focused data center consumes as much electricity as 100,000 households. So, the larger data centers now under construction are expected to use 20 times as much. And electricity use by data centers has more than tripled since 2014, and it's projected to more than double by 2030. And so that's the graphic that you're seeing on the right here, courtesy of Thousand Friends of Florida. Um, so you can see it's a huge issue, and it's only going to become bigger in the future. So, as you know, environmental impacts from construction in general, but especially large construction like data centers, can have huge implications for our wetlands, for our surface water, for stormwater. So, as you increase impervious surface area, you actually increase contaminated runoff potential. You decrease the ground's ability to slowly absorb contaminants, to slowly absorb rainfall and floodwater, all of which help protect our neighborhood and help protect, our ecosystems that are extremely vulnerable to contaminants. Another issue that needs to be considered is heated discharge water. When electricity gets generated and used, um, it can get discharged back into the river and have some extreme implications for our ecosystems. When we go into our moderated questions, Emily is going to go ahead and go into that a little bit more. But some implications that can result from heated discharge water are increased dissolved oxygen, fish stress, other aquatic organism stress, um, and it just creates a chain reaction from there. Like I mentioned, wetland impacts. When you do large construction projects, it usually ends up impacting a pretty substantial part of our wetlands, part of our uplands, and these all um, help decrease, flood runoff. Wetlands are known to filter nutrients. They're known to filter contaminants. They store water for really long periods of time and they release it slowly. There are river sponges, basically. And so when you get rid of them, it just creates a really big issue down the line. So again, storm and flood hazards, data centers are only as good as the fiber and the cables that they are made up of. They're extremely vulnerable to storm systems. Florida's low-lying elevation and our slow-moving rivers again make us extremely vulnerable to flooding. And so these are just some really big considerations to look at when you're looking at, whether or not you want to allow a data center to be constructed in your area. So in 2026, Senate Bill 484 was passed. It was actually just made effective July 1st. And it has a few good qualities, but there are some things, that are lacking in it as well. One thing that we should bear in mind is that it allows project details to remain exempt from public record requests for up to a year. And while it prohibits certain agencies from entering into non-disclosure agreements, it still prevents these project details that are essential from being known to the public for a year. So that's a big concern to us. However, a few good things that it has done is it has prohibited utilities from shifting data center infrastructure costs onto residential taxpayers. It reinforces existing water permitting rules, and it preserves local comprehensive planning and zoning authority. So it allows local counties to institute things like moratoriums if they don't want data centers built in their communities. It also requires a study to be done by July 1st of 2027 by the Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability. And so they basically have to report on the economic, resource, and public impact of large-scale data centers. All right. So while the rise in data centers is happening quickly, the way that it happens can still be somewhat controlled. So the counties that you see on your screen are counties that have approved or instituted moratoriums prohibiting data centers. So a hyperscale data center will often be seen as, industrial, utility support, telecom infrastructure, or like a warehouse-like use. If you're looking at permitting documents, if you're trying to keep an eye out on what to look for, on some key phrases. Many large campuses will pursue planned unit development zoning because it provides flexibility for like phased development, utility corridors, private substations, stormwater systems, that kind of thing. PUDs are more likely in areas like St. Johns County, Duval, developing portions of Clay, and many prospective data center parcels are currently rural and agricultural land conversion. And so you're going to be seeing things like timberland, silviculture land, rural ag land, or low density industrial reserve areas trying to be converted into data centers. So developers frequently target these areas because the land is cheaper, there's transmission corridors nearby, and setbacks are easier. But it comes with a trade-off because they usually require like comprehensive plan amendments, rezoning, wetland mitigation. So it's a lengthy process that you can be involved in as the public. So thank you guys for listening to my overview. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Dryden so she can go over our um, expert panel moderated questions. I will go ahead and keep an eye on the chat while we do that. So if you have any extra questions in the meantime, I will go ahead and let Dryden know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for providing a great overview for us. We're going to go ahead and kick it over to our panelists with some pre-planned questions we've got, and then we'll take some questions from the audience towards the end. So keep putting those questions in the chat, please. So first, we have Emily Floore. She serves as the executive director and Riverkeeper for St. Mary's Riverkeeper, where she leads efforts to protect and restore the St. Mary's River watershed and the communities that depend on it. As the river's leading advocate, she works to safeguard the health, beauty, and resilience of the watershed for current and future generations. And through advocacy, education, collaboration, and community engagement, Emily works with community members, partner organizations, and decision makers to address threats to the river and advance sustainable solutions. Her leadership helps ensure that St. Mary's River remains a thriving natural resource and cherished part of the region's identity. Thank you so much for being here today, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, we have Brian Smart, who is the executive director of the Florida Springs Council, Florida's only statewide advocacy organization dedicated solely to protecting and restoring Florida's springs and spring-fed rivers. Florida Springs Council advocates in the Capitol, courtrooms, and in local communities for the protection and restoration of Florida's springs. Prior to joining Florida Springs Council, he served as director of the Florida Conservation Coalition and president of Thousand Friends of Florida, bringing extensive experience in environmental advocacy and public policy. Hey Ryan, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, Dryden.
Thanks for being here. And then last but not least, we have Kimberleigh Dinkins, who serves as the Policy and Planning Director for 1000 Friends of Florida, where she works with citizens and communities on critical growth and development issues affecting the state's future. She also advocates before the Florida legislature to advance policies that promote sound community planning and protect Florida's lands, waters, and quality of life. Kim brings extensive expertise in environmental planning, conservation, and water resource protection, having served as Senior Conservation Associate with Save the Manatee Club, Senior Planner and Water Resources Coordinator for Marion County, and in resource management roles in both public and private sectors. Thanks so much for being here, Kim.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Great. Well, welcome to all of our panelists. We're going to start with some questions really about how data centers impact our local watersheds. And so first, Emily, a question for you in relating to St. Mary's River. What impact can data centers have on rivers in our region like the St. Mary's and also the St. John's? And how do they relate to water supply stress, water quality risk, ecosystem vulnerability, infrastructure, and resilience here in our local area?
Yeah, thanks, Dryden, for that. So just a clarification on a little difference between the St. Mary's and some other waterways in the state of Florida. The St. Mary's is mostly a precipitation and tributary fed river rather than a springs fed river. We do have a few springs, but it's not the biggest freshwater source for us. So our biggest freshwater source comes from the Osceola National Forest, the John Bethea State Forest, the Okefenokee Swamp, which is our headwaters, and then all the tributaries that flow through from Baker County and Nassau County in Florida, and then Charlton and Camden County in Georgia. So we are the border between Southeast Georgia and Northeast Florida. So I just wanted to make that slight clarification because mostly what St. Mary's Riverkeepers concerns are with impacts of data centers on water has to do with surface water, as well as aquifer, but because we're mostly a tributary fed river. So we've been focusing a lot on the impacts of drought. We've had a lot of, we've all experienced it, the phase 3 water shortages. And so drought conditions can really harm our water supplies and decline river flows. And that impacts our water quality and our water supply in the area, especially when it comes to potential impacts from new water and energy demands with more significant water needs. So some of the considerations we have with in our area for water and data center is the water supply stress, like you mentioned. So drought reduces surface water availability and groundwater recharge. New large water demands may increase pressure on an already stressed water resource during prolonged dry periods. The water quality risk that we're really concerned about is lower river and stream flows provide less capacity for dilution of pollutants. Not to say that the solution to dilution is pollution or pollution is dilution. We don't want to say that, but industries are not required to reduce their effluent discharge during periods of low water. So if there's less water, then there's the same amount of dilution or effluent discharge, then that can seriously lead to some public health risk issues with swimming and fishing in our river. And any wastewater discharge, any cooler system flushing, stormwater runoff impacts water quality during drought conditions. For ecosystems, for their vulnerability, warm, low flow conditions reduce dissolved oxygen and stress aquatic habitats. So that's when we can start seeing fish kills. That's naturally what happens in the St. Mary's. We go through ebbs and flows of high water and low water. So it's natural. The animals in the St. Mary's have adapted to it, but it can be exacerbated if more surface water is pulled from the system or more thermal pollution is added into it. And then additional water withdrawals during drought can further reduce flows to support fish and wildlife. As for infrastructure and resilience, this is really kind of the new niche that St. Mary's Riverkeeper has come into, is the resilience planning for a thriving St. Mary's River and its communities. Drought increases wildfire risk. The St. Mary's River watershed was recently impacted by some of these wildfires. Thankfully not, we were on the peripheral of the big ones that were in Clinch and Ware County in Georgia and other parts of around Florida, but low water flows can really cause wildfire issues and exacerbate it. And so growing electricity demand may require additional power generation, transmission infrastructure, and increasing pressure on regional resources rather than it going to becoming a first line of defense for our communities during a wildfire issue. So those are some of the concerns that we have and some considerations when we're talking about data centers in our area of the St. Mary's River region.
Thanks, Emily. And just kind of a quick follow-up just from the chat. What types of pollutants are we looking for in wastewater discharge from data centers?
Yeah, so a lot of that is still unknown, right? There's data centers have been around for decades, but nowhere near what we're seeing now. And the modern data center is not what it was 20 years ago when, Facebook became a thing, right? So we don't really know entirely what's all in them. We are starting, the sample size is pretty low, but there are some metal resistant bacterium that is being identified in treatment facilities. So Cheyenne, Wyoming has actually shut down their data center because of this. And they're saying it's going to be a massive cleanup. So it's causing issues. We're starting to figure out what's in the wastewater discharge, but the sample size is so small at the moment that there's not enough data to say for sure what is exactly there.
Great. Thank you so much.
And I see in the chat someone asked me what that was, so I'm just going to look it up because I'm not going to attempt to try to pronounce it.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And then Ryan, kind of piggybacking off of that, sending it over to you. Can you discuss the current status of Florida Springs and what are some of the larger threats that they face and how will data sitters influence them?
Right. And I mean, even though, the St. Mary's is more of a surface water system and springs are groundwater, a lot of what Emily said is still applicable. So I'm not going to kind of repeat everything. Clearly the biggest threat that we have to our springs is we're using too much water out of the springs and putting too much pollution, primarily nitrogen. But of course, all of these emerging chemicals, PFAS, the things that we're looking at today. One thing I would kind of expand upon is it's not just the flow isn't just important for water quality reasons because of the solution to pollution is dilution, but there's a lot of research actually showing that when you have enough flow, it will scrub the algae off of the plants and stop it from getting those buildups on top of the water, right? And that's what really blocks the sun from reaching the plants, which causes the huge die-offs. And a spring without plants is kind of like a piece of land without trees. It's there, it's not developed, but it's definitely not the way it should be. So, as we think about some of the really big water quality problems that we're facing in Central and North Florida, especially in, rivers and spring systems like the Suwannee, where we would need to see, like, say, an 80% reduction in nitrogen in order to achieve water quality goals. In the short term, with how intensive the agriculture is in that area, achieving that kind of reduction really is impossible. But what is possible in the much shorter term is to restore spring flow. It's a lot easier to shut off the taps, stop the pumping. We would see the benefit to the system really fast. And, just that flushing effect, can have major positive ramifications. Another area of emerging research when it comes to flow is the impact of blackouts. So there's a lot of cool research being done at the University of Florida Water Institute and also Paul Donsky at Swan River Water Management District, looking at what happens when the rivers actually come in and take over the spring. So anyone who's seen a spring, you usually have this nice, hopefully light blue, way too often green water, but it's relatively clear and sandy. And then you hit it when it hits the river, you'll see the mixing zone, and then you get into the more tannic river water. Well, this is that tannic river water coming in and actually going down into the aquifer via the spring vent. And while those are not very common, they seem to have very, very large long-term ecosystem impacts negatively on those systems. So, as we learn more and more, we're learning that maybe not surprisingly, flow is really important to springs. In good times, we don't have nearly enough flow coming out of our springs because our state has done a terrible job of regulating water use. So we have the Santa Fe River that is currently suffering significant harm for more than a decade. According to the state, it's in violation of its minimum flow and level. Despite that, they continue to issue consumptive use permit after consumptive use permit, further harming that river system. We have Silver River, which is set to fall below its MFL within 20 years. We have the Wekiva and Rock Springs that are currently below their MFLs and suffering significant harm. And we're waiting on Suwannee River, and my guess is that the Suwannee River will also be below its MFL. And those are in times when there is no drought. So now imagine what happens when you put the drought on top of it, right? Now we're seeing real impacts. I mean, the Santa Fe at places, you can just walk across it where you should be able to paddle in 3 or 4 feet of water. The sturgeon can't get up to Suwannee to breed during breeding season. It's up a little bit now, but they have been trapped in the pools. We're hearing of people whose wells are going dry, who are not able to use the well that they've had for 20, 30 years. So the drought is having a massive effect, and it really is it's showing us that we've done a very poor job of taking care of our water resources. I mean, Florida is so blessed, right? If you look at where we are on the map and you go over, it's a lot of desert in other parts of the world, but we have this Florida aquifer. that is really, it's our environment, our economy, kind of everything is based on this aquifer. And the last thing that we need is another massive threat to pull that water out, especially, in a state like Florida that's as hot as it is, with the kind of environmental resources that we have, the threats that we're facing, and the fact that we have state agencies that just do a terrible job managing it. Data centers are just completely wrong for North Central Florida when you look at where the springs and the rivers is. I mean, if you want to bring them in, then just tell me, are we going to stop letting people move here and get rid of houses? Or are we going to tell agriculture that they have to stop growing crops? Because the aquifer is a finite resource. And, the problem is we can always sink a deeper well, but the spring is where it is, right? So we're always going to be able to have water for everything we want, except for the environment, if we keep going down this path.
Thank you, Ryan. And that really does highlight, like you said, the finite resource that we have with our water and like the importance to conserve it and not put all of our eggs in one basket there. Moving on, Kimberleigh, can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of policies local governments in Florida are adopting for data centers and what should they be considering as good practices?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying I saw a couple of questions in the chat. The Georgia Tech has done a really good job of trying to of kind of combining all of the ordinances and things that we're seeing throughout the nation into kind of one place to give a summary of what local governments are looking at and state what different states are looking at. So, but we know that Florida is unique in some ways, and so there are some things that our local governments need to be looking at when they are considering data center siting in their jurisdictions. And so one of the things that is probably a good idea is to review their existing zoning codes and use geospatial analysis to look at areas where data centers might be allowed. But if they have the decision to make. Are they going to allow them by right, or are they going to require every data center over a certain size to come in for a special use permit? And the special use permit seems to be the way that a lot of local governments are going because it gives them some more control over what's actually happening on the site. And then it also gives them opportunities to negotiate a little bit more with community benefits and things like that. So in doing that, we really need to be looking at what are our statewide resources, even if they are those resources that are permitted under a different agency. So areas of critical state concern and our Greater Everglades ecosystem and particularly areas that are in a water resource caution area or are in a spring shed or a watershed that has an MFL that looks like it's going to be tripped and has a prevention plan. Those should be things that the local governments are looking at as possibly preventing large scale data centers in those areas. Again, even though a different agency permits them, I think a lot of times local governments think that they can't touch those types of issues, but they have to up front because otherwise they're just kicking the can down the road. And we know that those agencies are actually there to permit these uses. I mean, that's the way that they view it. So when they're looking at where data centers might happen, where are there significant wetlands within their community, and how do they protect those either by preventing data centers from being there or making sure that there are higher standards for data centers to go there. And you can use overlays and all kinds of different spatial analysis tools to do that. Communities should review their economic incentives to ensure that they're not attracting those large load customers without having those policies in place, those adequate development policies in place. And then I think a good policy would be to make sure that there aren't administrative waivers from whatever standards they do set, that everything should go in front of their board with sufficient public input. And then once they've decided how they're going to look at that and what might be the capacity for data centers in their community, there's all kinds of considerations. So those can be broken into like the site considerations, the operational side, and then what happens if and when the data center closes down. And so how do they close that out? Some siting considerations, a lot of them are dealing with setbacks. Large setbacks seem to be the trend. We're looking at some things like 300 feet from the adjacent residential or commercial areas, with some buffering that includes native buffering or natural buffering, noise reducing walls, berms, things like that, that local governments are adopting. They are looking at how, some local governments have put size limits, either maximum or minimum size limits for data centers for their sites overall. They are looking at obviously how those things are screened, like the ancillary what am I saying? The substations, electrical substations, the cooling systems, all of the things that really folks are concerned about what a data center looks like in their community. So how are they screening these ancillary uses? Do they look like just one broad warehouse, or a lot of times they're requiring some facade changes every 75 or 100 feet so that people aren't looking at just a blank wall. So that's some of the site design considerations, their environmental or their operational considerations, like the water use. It's very important for local governments to have all of the information up front. And so we mentioned that there are some exemptions from public records requests. Those deal mainly with the economic incentives. While a data center is doing their due diligence, they have a 12-month time frame where some of their public records can be maintained. But once they come in for a permit or a land use amendment or anything like that, that information becomes publicly available. So it's not beyond the county or the local government's purview to ask those questions about who the end user is going to be and what kind of water use they're going to need. We're looking at noise and vibration issues. Again, those sound dampening strategies, and then alternative energy sources. Some local governments have required a certain amount of alternative energy to be used over a certain time frame. I don't know how that would fly in Florida, but that's something that they're looking at. And then, of course, decommissioning. Once the infrastructure is available, as you mentioned earlier, as Zoe mentioned earlier, once the infrastructure is available, that can potentially relate to sprawl. And so having adequate policies in place to ensure that that doesn't happen, and that if and when a facility shuts down, it goes back to its original use, is something that local governments are looking at. So that was a long answer, but those are kinds of the buckets of policies and that local governments are facing.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Kim. Ryan, I just wanted to see if you had anything else to piggyback off of that about what additional safeguards are in place to protect our aquifer from impacts of data centers. And then can you specifically speak a little bit on consumptive use permitting?
Sure. I think that the big takeaway here is that if you think that our water management districts or DEP is going to protect us from the negative environmental impacts or social community economic impacts of data centers, that's just not going to happen. Whether it's development, phosphate mining, water bottling, concentrated animal feeding operations, whatever it is, our deep well injections of garbage juice, which is now something being contemplated for our aquifer. DEP in the districts issue permit after permit after permit. So, even if you were the laws right now in the state look great, but they're not followed. So anything that goes on paper that is a regulatory solution to this problem, don't believe it, because it's not going to stop these data centers. And once they're, with the technology as it is now, I think one of the commenters is right. There's just no capacity, at least in Central and North Florida, for these kinds of facilities. And, if we could fix our consumptive use permitting, there may be more room for these kind of things, but we don't require conservation. We don't require developers to develop in ways that ensure, conservation on a large scale or a small scale. And we issue permits well beyond what the aquifer can sustain. And, as we've seen that happen with every other industry, that's what will happen with data centers, which is why, in my opinion, the answer is just no, not here, not using our groundwater resources.
Thank you, Ryan. Changing gears just a little bit, Emily, could you speak a bit about the context of what's currently happening in Georgia and then what St. Mary's Riverkeeper is doing to face data center growth in your local community?
Yeah, and then I did see early on about how much water is actually lost to evaporative systems. It's about 80% of the water is lost to the atmosphere and is not returned to the system that it was given. Now, I don't know why you would want to try to evaporate water in Florida as a way of cooling with the humidity, but it works in other parts of the country. So But I just wanted to answer that question. So yeah, so St. Mary's Riverkeeper, we do work in Georgia, which, as you saw from one of the images that we had on the slide earlier, is number 5 in the United States for the number of data centers. And it is number 2 or 3 in the amount of megawatts it uses. So it has a large capacity, but it also has an even larger usage. So Georgia Power is the big electric company in Georgia, and they serve over 2.8 million customers. And in the last 3 years, Georgia Power has increased rates to its consumers 6 times. And so this year they put a freeze on our rates. I'm a Georgian resident, and they put a freeze on our rates, but that only goes to 2028. They are now forecasting that during peak energy, winter peak energy demand, over the next 20 years, it's 4.5 times more energy than what they projected just 3 years ago. So that tells you a lot. And a lot of that has to do with a nuclear power plant that its phase 3 just came online as well. But it has dramatically changed how energy is viewed in the state. So it's causing a lot of issues around here. It's causing a lot of reactions, especially in the southeast Georgia, where they seem to be starting to migrate to. So just to give 2 examples of how St. Mary's Riverkeeper has been engaging on this issue, we do not currently have large or even medium-sized data centers in our watershed. There are little ones that are in like closets. Those are the smaller ones, but none of like the facility ones or the warehouses. However, earlier this year, the city of Kingsland here in Camden County was going to pass an ordinance, a data center ordinance. And they were going to, there was a landowner that wanted to rezone from ag easement to light industrial, which would have allowed for a data center. And we stopped it. We found out that the ordinance did not go through legal. There was no public hearing. So we got it stopped and revoked, and now they have a 1-year moratorium in place. I have met with that company, that business that went that for that property. It was going to be a data center, and they're still going to go for a data center, and probably go through the county because the county just adopted a 6-month moratorium instead of a 1 year. So they're going to go to the shorter time frame. On the other side of the river in Nassau County, I think Nassau County deserves a very big shout out for the efforts that they are going through currently to do their research on data center impacts to their community. They developed a fact-finding committee, which St. Mary's Riverkeeper was a subject matter expert on. It lasted for weeks with several presenters, subject matter experts. 1,000 Friends of Florida was there. The Water Management District was there. Some energy company was there. So they got all kinds of experts to come in and talk about impacts to data centers. And it is on the resource link at the very end that Dryden will be sharing. But you can go to Nassau County and watch all those videos to hear from these experts. But we were a part of raising the alarm of a possible data center coming in. The company then came back and said, "Oh, just kidding, it was supposed to be a solar field farm," when their press release said additional things. So raising the alarm, raising the bells, what we're looking at is areas that are close proximity to fiber optics, the interstate, any kind of land changes or zoning ordinance changes. That can really be a big indicator. A lot of real estate companies are now saying like ideal data center location. So keeping an eye out just for the clear messaging rather than the hidden message as well. So St. Mary's Riverkeeper, we've taken a stance publicly that we are encouraging transparency from our communities, and that we have clear public hearings on what on the impacts of these to our community and to better protect them. Community benefits packages, of course, are in the conversation. Rural preservation of course, versus urban sprawl as part of our conversation. But as of right now, we're just trying to be proactive in getting guardrails in our communities that benefit our communities and not the data centers.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I know we're starting to run short on time. Kim, if you could give us just a very quick kind of anything else you want to add on Senate Bill 484, and kind of how that impacts our local communities. And then we'll open up the questions to the audience.
Yeah, I think that Senate Bill 484 kind of had four major components, which we've talked about a little bit. The one thing that is good for local governments is that it does give them the opportunity to kind of take a pause and look at their policies and figure out how they want to handle data centers because it puts those determinations squarely in the local government's hands. On the other hand, it's a little limited when especially when you're dealing with rural communities that might not have the personnel or the planning framework in hand to be able to address some of these things. So again, those moratoria that we're seeing are more of a pause than a no. That's what the intent is for them to go back and be able to look at some of those policies. The other thing about the water permitting, the consumptive use permit framework, that's not really any different than anything else we see. The ability to, require reclaimed is a great, it's a great, it looks great on paper, but they're already allowed to do that. They already are allowed to require reclaimed for a new water use permit. And we don't have enough reclaimed water, particularly in our rural areas, to supply these large scale data centers. I mean, think about Florida has done a really great job of allocating reclaimed water for things like golf courses and irrigation, landscape irrigation for folks. And so there's really not a huge amount that's even available unless it's going to be offset by fresh water or drinking water. And yeah, so it looks good on paper, but it's not necessarily feasible in a lot of locations. So I guess that's what I would say about it's a good start. We obviously have recognized in Florida, and the legislature has recognized that we need some guardrails. But we have a little bit more work to do at the state level, and then really need our local governments to step up and decide what's good in their communities.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you to all of your panelists for a thoughtful discussion. Zoe, I just wanted to see if you had maybe 2 or 3 questions from the chat that we want to pose to the panelists.
Sorry, I tried to mute myself and it wasn't working. Yeah, I see a couple here. One Marcos Bastian asked if we're aware of any model ordinances that we could use as references. So this presentation will be shared as well as the recording. The counties that were listed on one of the slides that have all instituted moratoriums, you can go to their city council website and look at the moratoriums that they've passed. They are not, they are not all one and the same. Some of them are 12-month moratoriums, some are 6 months, some are banning just rezoning, some are banning all large-scale data centers. So they differ, but you can go ahead and take a look at those counties. Let's see here. One of the questions from Nicole, have any of the active data centers used their heat generation for a geothermal renewable system for a community? I don't know if any of our panelists have an answer to that question. And I can repeat
I know
it.
that's happening up north. I don't know if it's happening in Florida.
There we go. I was going to say if we can make sure everyone's muted. So someone asked, Leo Fallon asked, where will we be able to locate the findings of the 2027 study ordered by SB 484?
I mean, when it's completed, it'll be available on the Opaga website as well. It should be on the Florida Senate and House websites as well. And hopefully, all of our groups here will be sharing that report out in about a year.
Mm-hmm. Janelle Milton asked what local energy facility discharges heated discharge water? There's quite a few.
I think that was to me. Can you say that one more time, Zoe?
Sure. She asked, let me find it again. What local energy facility discharges heated discharge water?
So not data centers, just energy.
I believe so. Yeah,
Yeah,
just like, electrical generation,
yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of thing.
So yeah, so you would definitely have that at any of the power plants, right? Like I remember going to, I think it was there was like Manatee Alley or something. There were just manatees everywhere, like on the discharge because of the warm water and everything. So if they generate heat, there's going to be heat removal or a need to get rid of that heated water. Um, and so that's one of the concerns of the data centers. And one of the counter arguments is the closed loop system. But I will say closed loop does not mean that it's entirely closed loop. They've had to get creative on how to prevent a lot of the contaminants from getting into the waterway. So a lot of them have their own wastewater treatment facilities now. But again, those still have to discharge into our waterways. And they're still heated in that sense. Um, and then there's some requirements now that all data centers have to be like off grid. So they have to provide their own electricity, they have to provide their own water. So that is also something that's coming up. But again, like closed loop does not mean that it's a net zero of a discharge. So it still has an impact, and those closed loop systems have to be flushed every so often. So again, I shared the article in the chat, right? That was a bacterium that was found in the municipal wastewater. So they discharge to the municipal treatment facility. And that's where they found that issue. So if that was going right out into our waterways, that could have caused a lot of issues public health wise and wildlife wise. So closed loop does not mean it's 100% closed loop.
Thanks, Emily. Zoe, I have one question from the chat that I want to pose before we wrap up, and then we can.
Absolutely.
Someone asked, what are the most impactful ways that we, the community and public, can advocate for the health of our waterways and regional resources? And that's open to the whole panel.
I think getting involved in a local organization that deals with these types of issues, the Florida Springs Council, 1000 Friends, your local river or water keeper are great ways to keep up to speed on this and to advocate. We always have advocacy opportunities through our organizations. And then being engaged when these things come in front of your local decision makers, your city or county commission, and making sure that they know that you're concerned about them as well.
100% agree. It's show up, make your voice heard. Your presence at meetings speaks louder than writing a comment on social media. Please show up at meetings, get engaged, make your voice heard, learn about the issue, and support policies that protect local water resources, infrastructure capacity, and community well-being.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much to our panelists for a thoughtful discussion. It was really great having you all here. We are going to continue this Keeping Current Lunch and Learn series, and we will have another one next month on PFAS in the river. So stay tuned for that. Again, this has been recorded. I will send it out to you all later today or tomorrow, and thank you so much for being here. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.